you look at our situation with rising food prices, rising fuel prices, we've seen in the last few weeks increasing levels of violent crime, you can see how all of this is linked to what's going on around the world. A global peace index from the Institute for Economics and Peace shows how peacefulness is declining around the world. You could put that another way. You could suggest that levels of violence appear to be increasing, or maybe to be better to say the potential for violence is increasing. The causes of this are pretty obvious. We had the pandemic, which caused huge economic and financial strain. Then Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That led to an increase in food prices and fuel prices that we're all feeling. David Hammond is the Research Director at the Institute for Economics and Peace. He joins us now. David, good afternoon to you. This is an important index. You try to measure how peaceful the world is. How do you measure that? How do you compile your index?
Sure, and thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. The Global Peace Index has been around since 2008, and how we compile that is by, first of all, trying to find indicators that fit within the definition. And the definition of the Global Peace Index is the absence of violence and fear of violence. So over the past 15 years, we've collated 23 indicators that capture the absence of violence and fear of violence. Every year we run this by an international panel of experts to ensure that the data is credible and the best data available to be able to capture this. And every year in June, we release an updated index. Now, the index itself is comprised of 3 domains. The first is a measure of safety and security domestically. The second is ongoing conflict. And the third is militarization.
So when you put it all together, what are you actually finding? You say that the world is less peaceful, levels of peacefulness are declining. What's actually happening?
Sure. Well, the past couple of years, we've obviously been looking at the impacts or potential impacts of COVID on global peacefulness. And I think what we're seeing now is many of the trends that we're witnessing are the sort of result of those potential impacts. So if we have a look at the actual number, peace is now at its lowest level since the inception of the Global Peace Index in 2008. It's now 3.2% lower than it was in 2008. And over the past 14 years, peace has deteriorated in 11 of those years annually. We're also seeing a number of very interesting trends in terms of the indicators that have been the lowest they've ever been over the period of the Global Peace Index. In particular, state-sponsored terror is now at its highest level since 2008. Political instability continues to increase. The past couple of years, we've seen a dramatic increase in violent demonstrations across the world. And if we have a look at refugees and displaced people, it's now at the highest level since World War II at now 88 million.
I mean, this really shows how interconnected we all are. So there was a pandemic that started in Wuhan, about as far away from South Africa as you can get. There's a war very far away from us in South Africa that's having a huge impact on us. So what I'm trying to get to is, I don't know what this would have been like 50 years ago, but certainly the world now is so connected that something that happens very far away from you can have a huge impact, as we've all seen.
Yes, that's one of the messages that we would like to convey with the Global Peace Index. Conflict is a global problem, and the effects of conflict anywhere in the world is felt by us all. Obviously, that's front and center with the Ukraine war, with fuel prices and the breakdown of supply chains. And how that affects local communities is really quite stark. If you have a look at the number of people who are facing starvation, that's now 48 million. That's up 40% over the past 6 months. And as rising fuel prices and global inflation continues to rise, we would expect to see that further increase. So yes, your point is very very valid. The globalization and interconnectivity of the world over the past decades really means that the conflict is everyone's in everyone's purview.
David, is this all about COVID? I mean, we blame the pandemic for so much. I realize the other big thing, which is probably not related to COVID, is Russia and Ukraine. What I'm trying to really get to put the question in another way, were the trends moving in this way before the pandemic already, or is a lot of it to do with COVID?
Sure, very good question. we'd actually seen a number of deteriorations prior to COVID. In particular, people's perceptions and faith in many of society's institutions had been deteriorating prior to COVID, and in particular, faith in media, faith in government, perceptions of corruption had been increasing. And I think the pandemic really came at a time when those things were coalescing anyway. So during the pandemic, we saw a number of violent demonstrations, and that the trend of increasing violent demonstrations has continued, obviously, through the pandemic and into 2022. But I think in answer to your question, the world was becoming less peaceful. The impacts of COVID in some ways accelerated some existing trends that were going on.
Is it possible for any country in the world to isolate themselves from this? I immediately think maybe of New Zealand because it's 2 islands, maybe Australia because it's sort of 1 island, maybe Switzerland because it's rich. But I'd imagine most countries can't really isolate themselves from this.
No, and I think part of the broader research agenda of the Institute for Economics and Peace is really to understand what the drivers of peace are. And in order to do that, we not only look at reports like the Global Peace Index, we also have a sister report, which is called the Positive Peace Index, which aims to understand the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. In that report and in that research, we identify 8 pillars of peace, that we've found that the most peaceful countries in the world are strong in all 8 of these. And one of those is good relations with neighbors. So certainly in a globalized world and with trade and interconnectivity prevalent, it's very hard to isolate. But also, by understanding what are the drivers of peace, it's not entirely clear that that would be a very good approach anyway, because in order to be peaceful, you have to also have good relations with neighbors.
If you look at these indicators, David, you know, there was a period, maybe I was just younger and optimistic, but it seemed that the world was getting better. And I would suggest maybe from probably the fall of the Berlin Wall through that sort of period of globalization, the end of apartheid in our country, but the end of communism in many others. And that led to sort of growing globalization, the Clinton years, the boom period, into the kind of 2000s. And I think people felt that, you know, to use the phrase, it was the end of history, that things were only going to get better. We found that that's not the case. It's tempting now to look at the situation and think, well, the world's only going to get worse. But again, that's not the case, which is a very long way of asking you, how do you think we're going to look next year?
Sure. The Institute for Economics and Peace, obviously, we tend not to try and predict the future. We don't have a crystal ball as to what's going to happen. But certainly the ongoing war in Ukraine is going to have an increasing deleterious effect on global peace. So the impacts of that will probably be around for a number of years yet. But having said that, there are a number of improvements that we see in the data that are worth noting. As I mentioned, we also research positive peace, which is the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. And we see globally that acceptance of the rights of others, health and education, equitable distribution of resources, and sound business environments have all been improving. Prior to 2022, good relations with neighbors was also improving, and that was an offshoot of increased globalization and trade. What we are seeing, though, over the past 10 years is perceptions of corruption has been deteriorating. So the offshoot of that is, when in the next 12 months, given the current war in Ukraine and increasing food prices, then we would expect to see the current deteriorations and trends to continue. But there are certainly a lot of positives that we can focus on to try and look longer term and build peace going forward.
David Hammond, thank you, Research Director at the Institute for Economics and Peace. Really important research. Shows you how interconnected we all are.